NBA team and possibly an NHL team here in Nashville. It's just too attractive a market to be ignored. Now, I don't know whether that's going to happen this year or next year or the year after, but I feel pretty confident that maybe when the century turns out here, when the decade turns out, that we'll have those kinds of Major League Pro sports here. If we can do it a lot, if we can do it very fast, that would be great. But I think now that we've built it, and given the attractiveness of the market and the interest that there is in pro sports here, I think it's very likely that will happen.
Not long ago, a team from the U.S. Olympics, I think, came by to look Nashville over for the possibilities. Now, how does the arena fit into that, and what are we able to offer that group?
We've been talking throughout the fall and this winter with the U.S. Olympic Gymnastic Committee. They will have a set of gymnastic trials in late June prior to the July Olympics in Atlanta in 1996, and they're looking for the proper city. They started out with, I believe there were about 33 cities that were in the hunt. That's been reduced this past fall to 4, of which Nashville is 1. The others are Boston, Seattle, and San Jose, so we're in pretty tough competition there. But they made their site visit here a few weeks ago, and we're expecting to hear in May of this year whether or not we've been chosen. If we're chosen, it'll be one of the very first events in the new arena, and be a great way to start it off.
You know, Mayor, not long ago, the Nashville National Association for the Advancement of Colored People held a conference here in Nashville, and of course you were there. And one of the things that they talked about had to do with the metro school system. And I know that you've been very interested in education, and especially the metro school system, and that quite recently the council passed a $110 million piece of legislation leading toward the schools. Let's talk about the metro schools and some of the things that you see.
Yeah, what you're referring to is we've just been talking about the arena, which has gotten most of the publicity. I do want people to know that an even larger amount of money than the arena went into renovation of the schools. I had, since I've been mayor, visited a number of schools. We have some ones that are in very fine shape. We also have some that are in terrible physical shape. And that seemed to me to be a good place to begin putting our investments. So I put into the budget, and the council subsequently passed and approved a bond issue of, I think it's about $115 million to renovate the schools, and that process is underway.
Very good. Now, and of course, it's almost impossible to move anywhere without talking about the major issues of crime and violence. And it's sad that, indeed, we do have to talk about that. But let's look at what Nashville is doing in order to try to decrease the teenage violence that we find on many of our streets and some of the other problems associated with crime and violence.
Well, there's lots of things, of course, that people are trying to do. They range from, I guess, the softest and the most long range to very short term. I've been working hard these past couple of months with Dr. Benjamin, who runs our school system, and Judge Shukoff, who's the juvenile court judge in town, to try and work some ways in which we put some strong deterrents, particularly against weapons in schools. I mean, ultimately, having schools a place where kids are safe, where they're free to learn without fear from, threat from weapons is a fundamentally important kind of thing to do. So that part is underway. We also are trying to do some things which lead children hopefully down a different path than shows them up in the juvenile justice system later. I'm a strong believer, for example, in these preschool programs, whether it be Head Start, which is basically a federal program, or what Caldwell School here in Nashville does, is a way of giving children who maybe who don't have all the advantages that some of their classmates might have had in their early years, giving them a head start, giving them a chance to kind of catch up and hopefully a better shot at doing well in school and not getting off into a life of crime. So all of these are pieces of the puzzle and things that we're working on.
Very good. And of course, Mayor, soon will become more involved in the gubernatorial campaign. And I would imagine that many of our viewers are familiar with some of your activities in that direction. And they'd like to hear some of the things that you have to say in reference to the state of Tennessee. We know that you came in as a political novice and you surprised everybody after you became mayor, and some of the very, very progressive things that you've done since you've become mayor, and some of the things, so why not take this time to talk about the gubernatorial campaign and some of the things that you see on the horizon for you.
Sure. It's it's something which I really had not thought seriously about until really this, I guess, this last fall. And I think when I got into the mayor's office, what I found was that a lot of the issues which I cared most deeply about and were the reasons why I got involved in politics in the first place were probably more fundamentally state issues than they were local issues, that the laws that really affected them were made at the state level. I'm a strong believer in jobs. I think that having a good job and having the availability of jobs and steady jobs is one of the foundations of any community, and one of the ways in which families build their version of the American dream. Is what lets you plan for the future and raise your family and go out and take part in the life of the community. I think that creating jobs and attracting jobs is something I have a knack for, and it's something I would like to be able to work on behalf of the entire state rather than just Davidson County. I believe I can do a good job. Crime, we touched on it in juvenile crime, but has become an enormous issue. And I'm a firm believer in truth in sentencing. The situation we have now where someone who commits a violent crime can serve just a tiny fraction of their sentence before they're back out on the street again it's gotten out of hand.
Explain that, Mayor. Perhaps many of our viewers don't understand exactly what is meant by truth in sentencing.
Well, give you an example. If a person were convicted today of aggravated assault, fairly serious crime, they would, and they were found guilty of that, they might be sentenced to 10 years. That would be a typical sentence for that. If they had not committed too many other crimes, they'd be what you call a range 1 offender. So that 10 years is automatically reduced to 30% of that number, or 3 years. We have a safety valve in place because we don't have enough beds, cells for everyone, which reduces it by another 40%. That makes it 1.8 years. You then get out, you get 16 days of time for good behavior every month, and that reduces it down slightly over a year. So what that means is that the person who was sentenced to 10 years, the public was told they were sentenced to 10 years, the jury thinks they were sentenced to 10 years, actually is eligible for parole shortly after 1 year, and about 30% of people get parole on their very first try out there. Now, if a person is sentenced to 10 years for something and serves 8 for good behavior, I don't have any problem with that, and I don't think anybody has any problem with that. But 10 years, meaning really 1 and change, is it's not a deterrent anymore. It's clearly a ridiculous situation and one that needs to be changed.
And of course,